The prairie was silent, save for the creak of the rancher's boots as he stepped onto the dry earth, the weight of 3 pairs of eyes fixed squarely on him. Across the yard stood 3 gunmen, their shadows long in the late afternoon sun, each man with a hand resting just a little too comfortably on his revolver. The air was so thick with tension that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He knew this was not just another standoff. It was the moment when his fate would be carved into the dust for all time. The rancher's hand hovered near his holster, steady but heavy, the kind of calm that came from years of surviving where weaker men had already fallen. He could feel the eyes of the land upon him, the hawks circling above, the cattle hidden in the distance, even the silent walls of the home behind him, all waiting to see if he would fall as so many had before. He was alone, or so it seemed, and the odds were written against him in the form of 3 loaded barrels pointed straight at his heart. The gunmen shifted their weight, boots grinding gravel, smirks cutting across their faces as they taunted him with silence. They believed him already buried, a man too stubborn to bow, too proud to beg, and too alone to win. The rancher's pulse beat like a war drum, yet his gaze did not falter. He knew the law of the West well. Sometimes a man must stand even when he knows the grave is waiting. And if he was to fall, he would fall with his boots on, unbroken. But then, when the world seemed to teeter on the edge of death, the silence shattered. A single shot rang out, sharp and sudden, not from his gun nor from theirs, but from inside the house. The crack echoed across the valley, sending birds scattering into the sky and freezing every man in place. The rancher did not turn, but he felt it. Someone inside had just changed everything. The balance of power shifted in an instant, and the gunmen, once certain of victory, now stood uncertain, their confidence splintered by a shot they had not expected. For the first time, the rancher allowed the ghost of a smile to touch his lips. He was not as alone as they thought. Somewhere within those walls, a hidden hand had chosen that moment to speak through fire and steel. And in the Old West, a single bullet at the right time could change the ending of any story. The gunmen froze, their eyes darting toward the ranch house as the echo of the unexpected shot faded into the canyon air. Dust rose around their boots, unsettled by the sudden crack of violence. The rancher's jaw tightened, his gaze steady as a hawk's, but deep within his chest, a storm brewed. Whoever had fired from inside had not only saved his life, but also shifted the odds in a game where death often claimed the winner. He stood still, refusing to reveal the flicker of relief burning behind his stern eyes. One of the outlaws cursed under his breath, gripping his revolver tighter, but the others hesitated. In the West, hesitation was deadly, and the rancher knew it. He leaned into that silence, letting it stretch long enough to sow doubt in their minds. His hand hovered closer to his holster now, daring them to test the ground they no longer owned. For men who had arrived certain of their victory, the ghost of uncertainty had already begun to rot their confidence. Inside the house, no movement followed. Whoever had fired remained cloaked in silence, leaving both the rancher and the gunman guessing. Was it a friend, a family member, or just a hired hand loyal enough to defend the land? The rancher did not need to know the name behind the gun. What mattered was that his enemies no longer believed they had cornered one man alone. The tallest outlaw spat into the dust, forcing a crooked grin. "One bullet don't change the end, rancher," he growled, but the hollowness in his voice betrayed him. Even in the harsh sun, a shadow crossed his face, the shadow of fear. He had seen enough standoffs to know that once the unknown entered the fight, death no longer answered to numbers, but to fate. The rancher adjusted his stance, the brim of his hat low over his eyes, and let the weight of silence fall once again. "Maybe one bullet's all it takes," he said, his voice steady, gravelly, certain. In that moment, the desert itself seemed to lean in, waiting to see who would break first. The standoff stretched into eternity, every breath thick with the promise of blood. The rancher's heart beat slow and measured, a rhythm carved from years of facing the barrel of another man's gun. He was no stranger to the odds, no stranger to death, but this time felt different. This time, he was not standing only for himself. The unseen ally within those wooden walls had made this fight something greater, something that could no longer be taken from him without a price. The outlaws began to whisper among themselves, low enough that the words carried only fragments through the dry wind. Their boots shifted in the dust, their eyes cutting from the rancher to the house, back and forth like men caught between two fires. Fear had crept into their ranks, and fear was a disease that spread faster than bullets. The rancher could see it, cracks in their unity, hesitation in their fingers, the slow unraveling of their bravado. Then, without warning, the second shot rang out. This one closer, sharper, deliberate. A hat flew from the head of the smallest outlaw, the bullet grazing just enough to split cloth without spilling blood. The man stumbled backward, his eyes wide with terror, the sound of his own heartbeat louder than the thunder of gunfire. Whoever was inside wasn't firing blindly. They were marking their prey, showing they could end a life whenever they chose. The rancher took one slow step forward, his spurs scraping against the dry earth. "Reckon you ought to think real careful about the next move," he said, his voice carrying like a sermon through the still air. The outlaws stiffened, their confidence bleeding out as surely as if a bullet had already pierced their chests. The power had shifted entirely. What began as a fight of 3 against 1 was now a fight none of them wanted. And as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with streaks of fire, the rancher knew the truth. The fight was no longer about who drew the fastest, but about who could stand longest under the weight of fear. And fear, in the Old West, had already killed more men than bullets ever would. The smallest outlaw, his hands trembling, glanced at the others as though seeking permission to retreat. But retreat was not in their code, not while pride outweighed reason. The tall one, clearly their leader, snarled and spat into the dust. "Coward's trick," he growled, his voice hard but his eyes betraying doubt. He tried to mask it with bravado, but the truth was clear. Their certainty was crumbling. The unseen hand behind that rifle had cut the ground from beneath them. The rancher, steady as stone, took another step forward. His boots pressed deep into the dirt, each movement deliberate, unhurried, daring them to flinch. The brim of his hat shadowed his eyes, but there was no mistaking the calm fire burning behind them. He was not bluffing, and they knew it. The silence around them felt like the held breath of the earth itself, waiting to hear which heartbeat would stop first. Inside the house, a creak of floorboards carried through the air. It was subtle, but it was enough. The gunman shifted nervously, realizing the shot had not been chance, but the work of someone who was moving, watching, calculating. The rancher's lips curved into the faintest smirk. He didn't need to reveal who stood at his back. Sometimes, mystery was the sharpest weapon of all. 3 against 1, the leader muttered, his voice lower now, but maybe not. His words were not for the rancher, but for his own men, an attempt to steady them before their nerves snapped entirely. Yet the doubt in his tone spread faster than fire in dry grass. The outlaws' hands twitched near their holsters, but hesitation lingered. Hesitation that in the Old West was often the last mistake a man ever made. The rancher let the silence hang just long enough before he spoke. "You came for blood," he said evenly, "but the ground you're standing on don't belong to you." His words struck harder than a bullet, not because of their volume, but because of their weight. They were a verdict, spoken like a man who had already seen the ending written in dust and blood. The leader's patience snapped. With a growl, he drew his revolver in a blur of steel, the setting sun glinting off its barrel. But before he could fire, another shot cracked from the house. This time it struck true, splitting the wooden post beside him, splinters flying like shrapnel. He stumbled, his shot never leaving the barrel, his face pale with the realization that the shooter inside had chosen mercy over death for now. The second outlaw cursed and yanked his weapon free, but the rancher moved faster. His revolver cleared leather with the speed of lightning, his shot ringing out as if guided by fate. The bullet struck the ground inches from the outlaw's boots, sending him sprawling backward into the dust. The rancher hadn't aimed to kill, yet. He wanted them shaken, broken, crushed under the weight of knowing they were outmatched from every angle. The air was electric now, the valley alive with echoes of fire and fear. Even the cattle stirred in the distance, lowing nervously as though they too sensed death circling close. The leader's bravado collapsed, his face drained of the cruel grin he had carried when he first arrived. His men looked to him for guidance, but all he could offer was the grim silence of a man who had just realized the grave had opened at his feet. Inside the house, the sound of the rifle being cocked once more filled the stillness. It was deliberate, loud enough to be heard by all. Whoever stood behind those walls wanted the outlaws to know the next shot would not miss. The weight of that truth pressed down on them like a mountain. The smallest outlaw's hand shook as he dropped his revolver into the dust, his courage leaking away with every beat of his heart. The rancher did not smile, did not gloat. He kept his weapon steady, his voice calm as he spoke into the charged air. "This is your last chance to walk away." His words were not a plea, but a command, carved sharp as steel. And in that moment, the three men understood. They were no longer hunters in this land. They were prey. The tall outlaw's eyes darted from the rancher to the window of the house, where a shadow flickered briefly against the curtain. He swallowed hard, his bravado thinning like smoke in the wind. The West had taught him that bullets were not always the deadliest weapon. Fear was. And right now, fear held the trigger. He lowered his revolver a fraction, though his pride refused to let him drop it completely. The rancher, steady as the mountains that framed the desert, did not move. His weapon remained trained, his stance unshaken. But inside his thoughts churned. He knew who stood behind those walls. He could feel in the timing, the precision of his shots. That hidden figure was no stranger to violence, no stranger to protecting this land. Still, he gave no sign of recognition. Let the gunmen wonder. Let their doubt eat them alive. The second outlaw, the one who had stumbled, pushed himself up from the dust. His face was twisted with rage, but his hands trembled as if caught between fight and flight. "Who's in there?" he shouted to the rancher, his voice cracking. No answer came, only the low whistle of the wind through the dry grass. And in that silence, the outlaw realized he was not just facing a man. They were facing a force bigger than themselves, a unity they could not see but could not deny. The smallest outlaw shifted nervously, sweat running down his temples. His weapon lay abandoned in the dirt, but he dared not retrieve it. He glanced at the tall one, waiting for an order, but none came. The rancher's calm was suffocating, his quiet authority pressing harder than the weight of a dozen rifles. The outlaws had come expecting blood and plunder, but what they had found was something far more dangerous: resolve. Inside the house, the floor creaked again, deliberate, measured. Then a voice, low, steady, unmistakable, cut through the air. "Leave now, or face the grave." It was not the rancher's voice, but that of a woman. The outlaws stiffened, their eyes widening in disbelief. The hand behind the rifle was not a man's, but hers. The revelation struck harder than a bullet. A woman's voice, calm and commanding, had shattered the illusion the gunman held. They had expected a faceless hired hand or a ranch hand loyal to his master. But a woman? In the Old West, where men believed they owned the trigger and the law, the thought that she stood with a rifle steady enough to hold three outlaws at bay rattled them to the core. The rancher did not flinch at her words. He had known she would speak eventually, and when she did, it would be with the fire of someone who had nothing left to lose. Her voice carried not only warning, but history, a depth born of nights spent defending hearth and home, of years weathering storms that men had thought would break her. To him, it was no surprise. To the outlaws, it was a revelation that stripped them of whatever courage remained. The tall leader sneered, trying to salvage authority. "You think a woman's gun will stop us?" he spat, though his words lacked the sharp edge they once carried. His bravado rang hollow, the kind of sound made not by conviction, but by desperation. Behind him, his men shifted uneasily, their faith in him draining with every moment they stood in the shadow of that house. The widow, yes, he knew now it could only be her, cocked the rifle again, the sound loud and final. "Try me," she said. And in that instant, there was no doubt. She meant every word. The outlaws felt it too, their hands stiffening, their bravado slipping away like water through clenched fists. The rancher, his revolver still raised, allowed himself a breath. Together, they had become something far greater than either could be alone. A line unbroken, forged by fire, loss, and survival. And the outlaws, for the first time, saw not a man standing against them, but a home, defended by two hearts bound to the land, ready to kill or die before surrendering it. The three outlaws stood frozen, caught between pride and terror, their shadows stretching long across the dirt as the sun slid lower. The rancher's revolver gleamed steady in his hand, and the widow's rifle crackled with the threat of fire from behind the walls. For a heartbeat, the desert felt suspended in time, like the entire West was watching, waiting for the next move that would write their names in a legend or bury them in silence. The tall leader wiped sweat from his brow, his jaw clenched as he measured the odds. He had ridden into the ranch certain of triumph, a man boasting 3 against 1. But now, standing on land claimed not only by a rancher, but by a widow with iron in her voice, he felt the first sting of something he had long mocked in others: doubt. Still, his pride screamed louder than his fear, and pride was the poison that had killed more men than bullets ever could. The second outlaw whispered harshly, "Let's go," his voice cracking under the weight of unseen eyes behind every shutter of the house. But the leader shot him a glare sharp enough to silence him. He wasn't ready to turn tail, not when the West measured a man's worth by whether he stood or fled. Yet the longer he stood, the more the rancher's calm gaze eroded his resolve. A man who doesn't blink in the face of 3 guns isn't bluffing. He's already decided how the fight will end. The smallest outlaw, weaponless and pale, broke first. He backed away slowly, his eyes never leaving the house. His hands shook like dry leaves, his breath ragged with the sound of a man who had already surrendered his courage. "Not worth it," he muttered, stumbling into the distance. The desert swallowed him quickly, his figure shrinking to nothing against the burning horizon. The leader's face darkened as he watched his man retreat, shame twisting in his gut. He turned back to the rancher, fury boiling over the cracks in his pride. "So be it," he hissed, drawing his revolver high, ready to gamble his life on steel and fire. The West, after all, was not built by men who backed down. It was built on those who drew first, no matter the cost. The moment stretched thinner than glass, fragile and waiting to shatter. The leader's revolver cleared leather, his fingers squeezing down, but the rancher was faster. His shot thundered across the yard, striking the ground at the outlaw's feet, close enough to kick dust into his face. It was a warning, one last chance for mercy, one last invitation to walk away alive. But the widow gave no such mercy. From inside the house, her rifle roared, a flash of fire from the window. The bullet screamed past the leader's shoulder, grazing the sleeve of his coat. He staggered, spinning back, eyes wide as the fabric tore, but his skin remained untouched. Her message was clear. The next one would not miss. The second outlaw panicked. His gun clattered to the dirt as he stumbled backward, hands raised in surrender. "No more," he gasped, his voice desperate. "This ain't worth dying for." He bolted after the first, leaving the tall one alone, his shadow now stretched thin and pitiful against the flames of dusk. The man who had once come boasting 3 against 1 now stood alone against 2 he could not break. The rancher's eyes burned like embers as he lowered his revolver slightly, not out of weakness, but as a final offer. "You've got no claim here," he said, his voice heavy as thunder. "This land, this home, this fight, it's already been written. Leave it behind, or we'll bury you." His words carried the finality of a grave dug and waiting. The leader's pride battled his fear in that instant, his finger twitching near the trigger, his breath ragged with fury. The desert wind howled through the valley like a judge's gavel, demanding a verdict. And though his hand trembled, the rancher and the widow knew. A man ruled by pride was already halfway in the grave. The tall outlaw's pride would not let him surrender. His hand steadied, his jaw tightened, and his revolver rose once more, this time aimed straight at the rancher's chest. The silence broke in a thunderclap, 2 shots fired almost as one. The outlaw's bullet split the air wide, but the rancher's revolver spoke first. A streak of fire lit the dusk, and the outlaw staggered back, his weapon slipping from his fingers as he fell into the dust with a thud that echoed through the valley. For a moment, no one breathed. The desert seemed to pause, the horizon painted in blood-red light as the echoes of gunfire faded into the distance. The rancher stood tall, his revolver still smoking, his stance unshaken. Behind him, the widow's rifle lowered from the window, her silhouette framed against the fading sun. Together, they had ended what began as a hopeless battle. 3 against 1 turned into nothing more than a man's pride crushed beneath the weight of steel and resolve. The fallen outlaw gasped, clutching at the wound in his chest. His eyes burned with fury, but the strength drained quickly from his body. He muttered words no one could hear, curses swallowed by the dust, until finally the fight left him for good. His body lay still, another name etched into the long ledger of the West, where pride was often carved into tombstones. The rancher holstered his weapon slowly, the weight of the moment heavy in his chest. He had stood against death before, but never like this. Not with someone watching from behind those walls, someone who had fought beside him with a steady hand and a heart forged in fire. For the first time, he realized he had not fought alone. The widow had stood with him, not in shadow, but in strength. And as the last rays of sunlight faded, the silence that returned was no longer the silence of fear, but the silence of survival. They had endured the storm together, and those scars would remain. The land itself seemed to acknowledge them now, not as 2 separate souls, but as a single, unbroken force. The yard smelled of gunpowder and dust, the final remnants of the standoff lingering like ghosts. The rancher lifted his hat and ran a hand through his damp hair, his eyes fixed on the house. Slowly, the door creaked open, and she stepped out, rifle still in her hands, her face half shadowed by the twilight. Her presence was calm, but her eyes carried the fire of what had just passed. She had taken her stand, and in doing so, rewritten her place in this land. They stood facing one another, the weight of unspoken words heavy between them. For a moment, neither spoke, but the truth was clear. This fight had not only defended a ranch, but had forged a bond sealed by survival. She had proven that courage knew no gender, no boundary. In the Old West, where lives were measured in blood and grit, she had claimed her place not as someone to be protected, but as someone who fought to protect. The rancher gave her a nod, small but filled with respect deeper than words. "Your aim was true," he said, his voice low and steady. She returned the nod, gripping the rifle tighter, her silence more powerful than any boast. It was enough. Between them, understanding grew, an alliance of hearts, not spoken in vows, but proven in fire. The desert winds rose again, carrying the dust over the outlaw's lifeless body, erasing the footprints of fear from the yard. The night came slow, stars flickering to life one by one, as if to bear witness that a story had been written here, a story of defiance, survival, and unity in the face of death. And as the coyotes howled in the distance, the West itself seemed to whisper, legends are not born in peace, but in the fire of battles won against impossible odds. The rancher and the widow turned back toward the house, the door closing softly behind them. Outside, the land was quiet once more, but the story of that night would travel far beyond the fences of their ranch. In saloons, in camps, in hushed voices by the fire, men would speak of the night a rancher faced 3 gunmen alone, and how a single shot from inside the house changed everything. The dust settled slowly over the ranch, the echoes of gunfire fading into the vast silence of the prairie. What had begun as a hopeless standoff, 3 against 1, ended as a testament to resilience and unity. The rancher had stood firm, but it was the single, unexpected shot from inside the house that changed the tide. Together, they proved that courage is not measured by numbers or strength alone, but by the will to stand when everything else tells you to fall. That night became more than just survival. It became a lesson etched into the land itself. The rancher's steady hand and the widow's unwavering aim spoke of a truth the West knew well. No man or woman truly stands alone when they carry conviction in their heart. It is conviction, not circumstance, that writes the final chapter of every fight. And sometimes a single voice or a single bullet can be enough to turn despair into hope. The widow's decision to reveal herself was not just an act of bravery, but a declaration that strength wears many faces. In a time and place where the world expected silence from her, she chose to speak through fire and steel. Her choice reminded all who would hear the story that power belongs not only to those who boast, but to those who act when the moment demands it. Together, they showed that survival is not about who draws the fastest gun, but about who carries the strongest will. Their story echoes as a reminder that unity forged in the fire of trial is unbreakable. And in the Old West, where legends were built on sacrifice and grit, their names would live on, not as two individuals, but as one force that defied fear itself. If this story touched you, let's lesson linger beyond the screen. Share your thoughts in the comments, so we can hear your voice among the echoes of this tale. Subscribe to the channel to ride alongside us through more stories where courage, sacrifice, and destiny collide. And don't forget to leave your like, because each gesture keeps these legends alive, carried across time like the desert wind that remembers everything.